September 1989 was life-changing. It was unlike anything I'd ever been through.
Hurricane Hugo swept through Charlotte like a thief in the night.
I think most of us all said, oh, we're too far inland. You know, hurricanes don't come in this far.
A sneak attack.
And we were in a coastal community that was on the bullseye. We got pulled into this thing.
By the time the sun came up, Charlotte was covered in trees, thousands of them. Some lined the streets, others atop power lines, and some stranded people in their homes. Over 90% of the city's homes didn't have power. Some wouldn't for up to 2 weeks. Further south, more homes destroyed, more families devastated.
The city of Charlotte, through Hurricane Hugo, learned how to handle crisis.
Tonight, what's changed because of Hugo and what still needs to change as we look back at the storm that no one who lived through it will ever forget. This is the path of the storm. Hugo, 30 years later.
Well, thank you for being here tonight. I'm WBTV Chief Meteorologist Eric Thomas.
And I'm meteorologist Al Conklin. Hurricane Hugo made landfall September 22nd, 1989 in Charleston. It reached Charlotte about 5 hours later. And Eric, what it left behind, it can't be denied.
You must be off the island by 12 noon.
The warnings.
Nobody has been through a storm like this. Nobody living in Charleston has seen a storm like this in their lifetime, if we have a direct hit.
The evacuations.
The thousands who jammed the highways leading out of town this morning, leaving behind boarded up homes, sealed up businesses, final messages.
September 1989. South Carolina was in the bullseye for a direct hit by a massive storm stirring off the coast.
It was unlike anything I'd ever been through.
Steve Crump was the first reporter from the WBTV newsroom to cover Hurricane Hugo.
I remember standing on Myrtle Beach a couple days before. Calm, people in the water, folks enjoying the surf, folks up and down the beach doing what beachgoers do. And there's this storm that is looming offshore, and nobody really seemed to take heed to it at that point. Yeah, we saw people boarding up their businesses and boarding up their buildings, but from the standpoint of there being any tangible evidence of what was going to happen some 48, 72 hours later, there was no signs of it. And then all hell broke loose.
When daybreak came, so did heartbreak.
I remember there being a yacht in the middle of Main Street in Georgetown.
As cleanup began, Steve Crump traveled the coast.
We ended up traveling every inch of US 17 from the Little River all the way down to Savannah and back.
The coastline in some parts, unrecognizable.
In many respects, Hugo was, as they say, the granddaddy of them all.
But the storm was far from over.
Hurricane Hugo traveled the path of a motorist going from Charleston to Charlotte. Comes up the coast, hits I-95, darts down I-26, comes up I-77.
Even as the storm arrived in Charlotte, it packed a heavy punch.
Giant plate glass windows blown out uptown, trees down everywhere, many on houses.
There was a National Guardsman with a rifle directing traffic because the power was out and the traffic lights were not working.
Tens of thousands of trees were down, millions of people in the dark. They would be for days, even weeks.
Hurricane Hugo brought out the best in people, and it also brought out the worst in people.
And it brought lessons we still go by today.
The city of Charlotte, through Hurricane Hugo, learned how to handle crisis. Whenever there is a hurricane warning now, and you see if it's going to be a Cat 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, people here in these communities as far away as Burke County, they're taking notice, they're taking heed, and you don't have to go far away to see that there are trees that are still down from that weather event that happened some 30 years ago.
You heard Steve mention the storm traveled like a motorist, and it did.
Right, Eric, with a vengeance. And let's head you over to the maps right now and show you how this thing unfolded. First off, we take you to the midnight hour here in the Charleston area. Hugo, a Category 4 hurricane, top winds 140 miles per hour sustained, gusts in the Charleston area up to about 110 miles per hour. Didn't stop there, though. Eric, this thing continued to move northwestward across the Palmetto State.
Yeah, Al, at 2 a.m., Hugo was between Charleston and Sumter. Look at this, still packing sustained sustained winds of 100 miles per hour. In fact, they clocked a wind gust of 109 miles per hour at Shaw Air Force Base. Now, to put that in perspective, we want to show you this video of a researcher just trying to walk in 109 mile per hour winds. This video was taken at the Mount Washington Observatory a few years ago. Now, obviously, this is not from the hurricane, but just look at how much he's struggling. Next, the storm closed in on Charlotte. Al?
Yeah, that it did, Eric. Within 3 hours, Hugo was knocking on the door here in Charlotte at 5 o'clock in the morning across I-77 here between Columbia and Charlotte. And again, get this, incredibly, the winds 100 miles per hour here in Mecklenburg County. But it didn't stop there. Hugo continued to move northward and westward across the foothills, nailing Hickory and Morganton, downgraded to a tropical storm then as it moved across the state line and headed up into West Virginia. And when you think back to Hugo, around here a lot of people, they don't talk so much about the rain, it's the wind and of course the tree damage. Now we dug into the WBTV archives and found part of Eric's analysis of the wind speeds when it arrived here in the Queen City.
And look at this, Mike, even on this picture. Yeah. This picture here showing where the eye was still just barely defined, but look at this, 180 miles, and it came all the way up into the Piedmont.
Well, you might have noticed how brown my hair was there. After Hugo, this is what it looked like. But speaking of archives, I remember going home that morning to check on my wife. She was 5 months pregnant. Now, as I drove home, the destruction shocked me. So she and I decided to take out our camcorder and document what we saw. Here is some of that now.
Well, this is our neighbor's lawn. These are the people who live behind us. I'm standing at the back of my backyard. And absolutely incredible. Just an incredible scene. What makes it so incredible is the fact that this is not something that happened on a street in a particular neighborhood. This happened all across the southern Piedmont of North Carolina. We could just shoot this video for hours on end. It is just all over the city. I have seen I-beams bent like rubber. It was like a 75-mile wide tornado. There's just no other way to describe it. The whole city. There are stoplights on the street, signs blown down.
Wow, that is just incredible stuff, Eric, and I love the shorts and I love the socks you had on there in that home video. I tell you what, though, incredible damage here across the Piedmont. And when you think about it, we've tracked these hurricanes for so many years. The Piedmont typically doesn't get those kind of direct impacts from a hurricane, but areas inland are in fact at risk. And I recently talked about these inland threats with one of the most well-known meteorologists. You know him, my good friend Jim Cantori.
People don't realize that well inland in the southeast, sometimes you're even more in the line of fire than you are along the coast. Yep. Sometimes a weak system can come in and stall over inland areas and produce prolific amounts of rainfall. Of course, Harvey was a strong system that came into Texas. Then it also stalled over Houston.
All that rain can cause detrimental flash flooding. Now, Jim's been covering hurricanes for years, and when he shows up in your town, a lot of people usually clear out because they know something bad is right around the corner. I asked him about Hurricane Hugo and what he remembers about covering that storm.
It's kind of a double-edged storm. If a storm moves too slow, you flood. All right? If a storm moves too fast, as was in the case with Hugo back in '89, you had a classic Cabo Verde storm that came across the Atlantic, developed, futzed around a little bit over the central Atlantic, then all of a sudden was regenerating and developing as it was making landfall and accelerating. So you don't have time to wind it down. And you remember certainly what happened in Charlotte. Yeah. You had massive amounts of tree damage.
Yeah, you know, one of the things, Al, you hear about the rain and the inland flooding, but that just wasn't an issue with this one because it was moving so fast.
Right. This was almost just the opposite of like a Florence, which was a Category 1 by the time it landed at Wrightsville Beach last year. But it just sat there installed, and we saw that just recently with Dorian over the Bahamas. But you're right, this thing was like a shot. It came in at Charleston, and by later that night, it was over Buffalo, New York.
Yeah, and the problem was with that really high forward speed and the strong winds, you just cannot spin down a Category 4 hurricane in 3 or 4 hours. But the moment, the epiphany for me was when we walked back to the AM radio studio. The sun had come up. We looked out the back window where we had a big grove of trees back there. It looked like Godzilla literally had come through and just just trampled all of those trees.
Yeah, and of course, over the following couple of years, by the time I arrived here in Charlotte, I remember how many times Steve Onesorge up in the foothills was talking about all the fuel from HUGO, right? All the trees that stayed in the forest that then became brush fires for 3, 4, 5, even 10 years later. So just an incredible legacy that didn't just go away with the chainsaw, you know, a week or two later.